This will be an independent Visegrad analysis. The term Visegrad group comes from the town of Visegrad. In this town, in the year 1335, Charles I of Hungary hosted a 2-month congress with the Bohemian king, John of Luxembourg, and the Polish king, Casimir III. This congress was crucial in creating a peace between the three kingdoms and securing an alliance between Poland and Hungary against Austria. Another congress followed in 1338. Therefore, Visegrad, as a historical site, represents the unity of Eastern European powers against the imperial or Atlanticist Western powers. Today, the Visegrad group includes Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, with the stated purpose of advancing military, cultural, and economic cooperation between member states. The Visegrad group first formed on the 15th of February 1991, and all 4 member states joined the European Union on the 1st of May in 2004. But what if the Visegrad group left the European Union? And what if the Visegrad group enlarged itself? Could it ever achieve true economic, military, political, ideological, or cultural independence? Now, the Visegrad group is not the first modern iteration of a Eastern or Central European Unitarian concept. The Intermarium was floated prior to World War II as a union between Poland and Romania and other Eastern European countries, both against Russia and against German imperialism. It obviously failed against the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, but one of the significant or I suppose relevant effects of it was that the Polish troops did have a plan to retreat from Poland to Romania. Now, the significance today of an independent Visegrad is largely connected with its perceived Euroscepticism and its whiteness. Euroscepticism, or anti-EU sentiment, is largely a consequence of both the original and the contemporary telos of the European Union. The European Union was founded by practical idealists, and one of them, Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi, he wrote in his book Praktischer Idealismus in 1925 that the man of the future will be of mixed race. The Eurasian Negroid race of the future will replace the diversity of peoples with a diversity of individuals. So obviously that's in conflict with whiteness, with white nationalism, with ethno-nationalism. Whereas Western Europe has a high number of non-white residents, both illegal or illegal, both temporary and permanent, the Visegrad countries are relatively white and relatively homogeneous. White nationalists have long praised the Visegrad group as forming a new nucleus for ethnically homogeneous white homelands. I'll take as an example February 17, 2016, the Daily Stormer published an article from the New Observer called Eastern Europe, Defender of Civilization. And I'll read out the first paragraph for you. It states, "There is little doubt that within the very near future, Eastern Europe will take on the mantle of defender of European civilization and ultimately the European heartland, which will serve as a homeland and regeneration point for the European people." End quote. So there's a few other figures on the right who are considered leaders or who are considered intellectuals or who are considered influential. We could start with someone who's not necessarily a white nationalist, but someone who's spoken with, Greg Johnson, who's spoken with TRS. I've spoken with him. It's Kurt Doolittle, founder of the Proprietarian Institute. He's taken up residence in Ukraine. And we could say that's coincidental, but we also have the founder of Countercurrents, Greg Johnson, who lives in an undisclosed Eastern European country. So he's also found his home in Eastern European. Again, it could just be the cheap housing prices, but then you take David Duke, who's one of the most well-known white nationalists in the world. He received his doctorate degree in Ukraine. Few other countries would ever have anything resembling a university that would grant someone like him a doctorate, but he managed to find it in Ukraine. You also have the now-defunct Traditionalist Workers' Party. Their leadership promoted Orthodox Christianity, although they claim to be accepting of all religions. And it did have a predecessor in the Traditionalist Youth Network, which was much more explicit in borrowing the symbology of Alexander Dugin's Eurasianist movement. It's the chaos symbol with arrows pointing out in 8 different directions. Then you also have Richard Spencer, president of the National Policy Institute, who looks like he's going to be the new David Duke of the coming generations. Married Nina Koprianova in 2010. She's a Russian national who translated Alexander Dugin's works into English. In 2013, you can go on YouTube, find plenty of Russia Today interviews with Richard Spencer, since he's sort of become a more taboo figure. They've not been interviewing him. Ryan Falk, someone who has now sort of denounced white nationalism and just is more of a dissident right figure. He's done a lot of analysis on mainstream anthropological views on race. And he cites Eastern Europe and Russia as a region in which it is the mainstream opinion among anthropological experts, that is to say, people with PhDs in anthropology. They believe in the position that race is real in an anthropological sense, whereas in the West you're more likely to hear someone say race is a social construct. We also have in the mainstream media the question of whether President Trump has any connection to Russia. I don't want to go into that, but it is very clear, at least from what I've just sort of jotted out here, that there are quite a number of white nationalists or people who are affiliated with the pro-white movement in general. They see Eastern Europe as a good place to live, if not a future homeland. Certainly it's true that Eastern Europe has cheap real estate, it's relatively white, it's relatively homogeneous, but does this present state of Eastern Europe translate into a solid political future? That's what I'm investigating today. Now, if you want to go visit Eastern Europe yourself, you can do so quite cheaply, and you can have your own experience there and get a feel for what it's like to be in Eastern Europe today. But what I'm trying to do is project into the future and see what is the broad geopolitical trend of this region. Is it everything that white nationalists hope it will be? So let's start with what's been in recent history. We've had on the 3rd of April 2014, Czech President Miloš Zeman announced at a press conference in Slovenia that Slovenia and Austria will participate in an enlarged Visegrad group in the future. Then on January 29th, 2015, the Slavkov Trilateral came into effect. It's a loose cooperation agreement between Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Austria. Petr Drulák, the Deputy Minister of the Czech Republic, emphasized that the Austerlitz format, it depends on which country you're in, they changed the name of it, but this Slavkov Trilateral, it was in addition to the Visegrad Group, it was not a contradiction with the Visegrad Group. So clearly we see here happening in 2014, 2015, we see the potential emerging for an enlargement of the Visegrad Group. What I want to analyze is this hypothetical enlargement of the Visegrad Group. So in order to construct a model for enlargement, I analyze European countries according to 2 factors. The first one is the number of non-white immigrants, and the second one is the size of its largest anti-immigrant parties. Because I think this is basically how the Visegrad Group has been recognized and how it has established itself as a political force is on this question of non-white immigration, both implicitly and explicitly, with people like Viktor Orban referencing the white race quite explicitly, other times doing it implicitly through the use of the word Christendom. I think this is really the defining political question that faces the Visegrad Group and whether it can survive as this independent entity. Now, in my model for an enlarged, I wanted to take the most optimistic course because I think that I think there is a tendency within politically extreme positions or within, let's say, there's a tendency for idealism, there's a tendency for optimism, there's a tendency to look at historical trends and say, well, who could have predicted the Russian Revolution, or who could have predicted the rise of Bolshevism? Well, the people who ultimately did predict it were somewhat fanatical. They were somewhat idealistic, people like Marx, people like Lenin, people like Trotsky. So, if we are to predict the future, we do have to at least take into account the possibility of really enormous changes happening, and at least we can construct an optimistic model, and then we can see how it plays out, see sort of what the cause and the effect of these sort of things would be. So in the case of Hungary, I analyzed it from the point of view of saying that there are a large number of non-whites living in Hungary, but they also have very powerful anti-immigrant parties. So basically, I looked at the ratio. In the other case, you have Estonia. Estonia has a very small percentage of non-white residents, but it's a corresponding situation. They don't have a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. And so really, I wanted to look at the ratio of the two factors. I wasn't just looking at, is this country anti-immigrant, or I wasn't looking at the country, does it have a lot of non-white residents? I was looking at the ratio because I wanted to see the future potential for enlargement of the Visegrad group. Estonia, I think, is a country that could be convinced to join the Visegrad group if non-white immigrants were introduced into the country, even though at this point Euroscepticism is pretty low. So, on the other hand, I wanted to talk about some of the countries I didn't include in the enlargements because I think they would defeat the purpose of the model. The purpose of the model is not to say, what if all of Europe suddenly switches? This is sort of actually something that's been put forth by very few people, but one of them would be Richard Spencer, and I guess as a predecessor, you might look at Francis Parker Yockey. And Yockey looked at NATO as, when he was living and when he was writing, he looked at the prospect of NATO in the short term as being something bad because it was not racialist in its orientation, but he thought that NATO could be subverted, or NATO could be set up for one purpose but then reused for another purpose. And so acting out of that tradition, or speaking out of that tradition, Richard Spencer has said, well, perhaps the European Union could flip. Like currently it's going in this anti-white direction, but if suddenly the leadership were to change in sort of a revolutionary scenario, in the same way that you had revolutionary France was very left-wing, but all of a sudden Napoleon takes over, and he uses that revolutionary energy in a totally different direction toward imperialism and expansion and pan-Europeanism. So there's a kind of flip that happens occasionally in history. Now, if that flip were to happen with the European Union, the consequences we'd be talking about a much different model there. I'm talking about a model in which the European Union survives in some capacity in its core region, which I say is France and Germany, but that there is an alternative to the EU that forms in Eastern Europe. And I'll explain later why that does not include Russia, and why it solely has to be between Russia and between Germany, essentially, is this region for this Visegrad enlargement zone. So just explaining why I don't think Germany would be a candidate for joining the Visegrad in my model is because even though Alternative for Deutschland is a growing party, there are a huge number of non-white immigrants in Germany to the extent that even if Alternative for Deutschland had 30% or so of the voters, about 30% of Germans, or 30% of people being born in Germany in this current year are non-white. So if you have the anti-immigration party and it can't get more votes than the number of immigrants or immigrant descended people, then that's not that's certainly a case for tension and for a dangerous, unstable future, but it's not a case for that country entering peacefully into a Visegrad group. A Visegrad group nation, according to my definition, has to be a country with relatively low numbers of non-whites and strong anti-immigrant support. Germany doesn't have that situation. There's certainly growing anti-immigrant support, but there's also a huge number of non-white immigrants, especially in key political centers like Berlin, which I believe at this point is majority non-white, or at least majority non-ethnically German. In the case of the 2017 French election, you had Marine Le Pen. she won about 33.9% of the vote. And that was against Macron, who is now deeply, deeply unpopular. I think he has less than 20% popularity. So, again, it's a situation where I can't look at these countries as potentially being part of the Visegrad group. And I also looked at data polling populations in terms of how much do you favor the EU. And so there were different populations which voiced their opinion, how much do they identify as a member of their country, as a patriot, and as a member of the EU. And I also use that sort of data. So you have other countries such as the Netherlands, such as Belgium, which are the population is much more internationalist in the outlook than typical members of the Visegrad group. And if France or Germany exited the EU would basically cease to exist. So my question is not really about the sustainability of the EU project itself, which especially, it was very much in question. I mean, who knows where the yellow vests will take it, if they'll be successful or not. I'm going to say not. That's why I'm, constructing this model on these principles and these assumptions. It's really a question of, if the EU continues to exist, but the Visegrad group was able to have some kind of independent status, what would be the conclusion of that situation? How would things unfold? So in my model, I came up with 22 potential future Visegrad members. I doubt that all of these countries would join an independent Visegrad. But again, this was my most optimistic model. I think if the EU still existed in any capacity, it would apply a lot of pressure and sanctions and basically everything it could do to keep people from joining an independent Visegrad. Of course, the Visegrad today is not independent. It's part of the EU, but again, this is a theoretical scenario. You could also call it the intermarium if that helps with the confusion. So I listed these countries from top to bottom, 22 countries according to population, and I looked at their GDP. Now, the member state within my model that had the biggest population, the biggest GDP was Italy. Italy has about 60 million people and $1.9 trillion US dollars in 2017 for its GDP. Now, the second most populous member in my, again, optimistic model, Ukraine would be joining our intermarium, and Ukraine has a population of 42 million. It had a GDP of 112 billion, which is about 1/20th the size of Italy. Extremely small compared to Italy. Very poor compared to Italy. So already we're seeing a huge problem here in terms of Italy in this model would be really carrying our intermarium group. And, as we know from history, Italy is not very good in playing the game of geopolitics. The third member here would be Poland. Poland has 38 million people. It's got a GDP in 2017 of 525 billion, which is 5 times better than Ukraine. But still, it's only a fourth of Italy's GDP. So still, these secondary and tertiary countries are not measuring up to Italy. This doesn't look like a partnership of equals. It looks like Italy basically ruling this intermarium pact in the same way that today Germany sort of overwhelms and rules the EU member states. Next we have Romania, Greece, Czech Republic, Hungary, Austria, Switzerland, Bulgaria, Serbia, Denmark, Slovakia, Norway, Croatia, Moldova, Lithuania, Macedonia, Slovenia, Latvia, Estonia, Montenegro. Montenegro being the smallest with about 622,000 and 4.8 billion GDP. Now, some of these might be controversial picks, and I get that. I'm adding these picks not because I think that they're realistic, but because I think they're optimistic. And so I wanted to construct the most optimistic model, basically against my own biases. As you'll see in my conclusion, I wanted to set up a model and say, like, hey, look, here's the best possible scenario. Now, of course, we could go down some of the more controversial picks. Switzerland is typically a neutral country in terms of entangling political alignments. especially controversial ones like the anti-immigration stance, but it does have strong anti-immigration support, so that's why I put Switzerland on the list. Denmark, again, has a pretty hard line in immigration policy compared to its neighbors Germany and Sweden. Same thing with Norway. Norway has few immigrants and strong anti-immigration policies. Going down the list, some of these like Estonia. Estonia doesn't really have a strong anti-immigration party, but it doesn't really have a problem with immigrants flowing into the country. And so I put it on the list again, sort of saying that it's a country that were immigration to become a bigger threat than it is today, that perhaps Estonia could be coaxed into joining this kind of a union. Okay, so we're going down the list here, and my explanations for those could be defended on an individual basis, but that was sort of the heuristic I used. So the total grand population of the Visegrad group, or the Intermarium, would be 258 million people, which is not an insignificant number. This would be bigger than Russia. It'd be smaller than America, but it would be pretty big. The total GDP would be 5.6 trillion United States dollars now. That sounds pretty big, but again, go back to Italy. Italy is about 1.9 trillion dollars, so not quite half, but 40% of this GDP would be from Italy alone, which is going to be very problematic. Now, the GDP per capita for the Intermarium on average would be $21,000, which is really, really low. For comparison, in the United States, the GDP per capita of African Americans is $20,000. So we're talking about people who are not that much rich on average than African Americans. So in terms of geopolitics and dominance of the European continent, you got a big problem there. Now, another big problem I'm going to preview before we go on to the other political blocs is the fact that Poland and Ukraine, in their nationalist movements, there's huge tension between them. So if you go to a city in Ukraine called Lviv, there's a cemetery there. There's a huge controversy over the fact that Polish nationalists want the Polish dead, because there are a lot of military dead buried in Lviv. It used to be a mixed Polish-Ukrainian city. And Ukraine is taking measures basically that are seen as offensive by the Polish nationalists. And so to have Poland and Ukraine in the same political bloc would be a huge accomplishment, especially when we're talking about the Visegrad being based on the principle of ethno-nationalism. Of course, the nationalist concerns are going to be even bigger in that kind of a political scenario, and so it'd be very difficult to get Poland and Ukraine to work together. You can also imagine how Russia and Germany wanting to split apart Poland and Ukraine would even inflame these nationalist tensions further, perhaps using double agents and whatnot to desecrate certain parts of these historical sites and cemeteries, inflaming tensions further and preventing this sort of political union from taking place. The other problem is that the Intermarium, in contrast to Russia, which is increasing in population, as well as America and even Western Europe, it has a decreasing population. Now, I've had some people, I had a Polish guy who didn't have the best grammar. I don't care about people's English, but he wasn't just coherent in his thoughts. He was saying, well, that's not really true. We could increase our population if we wanted to. That's not what the statistics show. The statistics show that people want to leave the bloc, that Eastern Europe generally, and the fertility is pretty low. I mean, if you want to talk about these countries as religious countries, they have extremely, and I don't believe they are, and we could look at some data to actually see what the religiosity is, but fertility is pretty low, so that is a bad projection if you want a stable country. Alright, so let's compare this to a reduced EU bloc. I left 14 countries in the EU, and I also added Albania, Bosnia, and Kosovo, because I think once the European Union becomes more both more Muslim and more secular. Essentially, the share of Christians decreases in the European Union. I think places like Albania, Bosnia, and Kosovo are going to be brought into the EU. And I don't think they're going to be opposed to immigration. But I did exclude city-states like Andorra and so on from the analysis. So the biggest one would be Germany, with about 83 million people, GDP $3.7 trillion. Next we have France with 67 million people, $2.6 trillion, 2017. And then we have Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, Sweden, Finland, Ireland, Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, Luxembourg, and Iceland being the smallest, with a population of 355,000, a GDP of $24 billion. So the total population of this European Union would be about 266 million people. It's slightly larger than the Visegrad Group. It's also projected to increase in population. The total GDP would be $10.4 trillion, about double that of our Visegrad Group. So, concerning the GDP, it's possible to grant that Eastern Europe has a certain higher growth rate in economic terms than Western Europe. However, if you look at the 2008 crash, countries like Ukraine fared much worse than Western Europe. And the way I analyze this, or the way I explain it, is to say that basically Eastern European growth is a product of Western investment. If Western investment is cut off, Eastern Europe will collapse, and that's why countries in the Visegrad Group don't want to leave the European Union, because it's their cash cow. Now, the GDP per capita of this EU, the reduced European Union, is about $39,000 per person. It's about twice that of the Visegrad Group. Now, GDP per capita is very important because when we talk about warfare, not just guns and planes and bombs and tanks, we're talking more about psychological warfare. We're talking more about technological cyber warfare, warfare of public opinion. And the people who are going to be able to operate effectively on those terms are going to be programmers, social engineers, social media experts. And those types of people tend to be highly educated. They tend to be people with higher incomes. So having that increased GDP per capita allows for more expenditure on education, more years in education, and more focus on psychological warfare, social networking warfare, and not just tanks and bombs and guns and that sort of generation of warfare. So that's an important thing to understand if we're talking about a conflict between the Visegrad and the European Union in terms of a Cold War. In the same way that Russia lost the Cold War, not because it was defeated militarily, but because it was defeated culturally, socially, psychologically. We're talking about, is this Eastern European bloc, this intermarium, going to be able to survive in a conflict between itself and the European Union? Now, I want to get into Russia at this point as a third bloc. And I want to distinguish between Russia and the intermarium or the Visegrad because Russia is decreasing its percentage of the ethnic Russian majority. Since the collapse of the USSR, the non-Slavic immigrants to Russia have come from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and China. However, even if Russia stopped all immigration, legal and illegal, right now, there would still be a problem. In 2009, 8 of Russia's federal subjects had a total fertility rate above 2.1 children per woman. So again, there are many different federal subjects in Russia. Russia is a federation. In the same way that the United States is 50 states, Russia has all these different federal subjects. Only 8 of them had fertility rate replacement. Now, these federal subjects were Chechnya with 3.38, Tuva with 2.81, the Ust-Orda Buryat Okrug with 2.73, the Agin Buryat Okrug with 2.63, the Komi Permyak with 2.16, the Evenk Okrug with 2.58, the Altai Republic with 2.36, the Nenets Autonomous Okrug with 2.1. So, of these federal subjects, only 4 have an ethnic Russian majority: the Altai, the Evenk, the Ust-Orda, and the Nenets. And we have to then look within each of these federal subjects and look at where is this birth rate coming from? Is it coming from the ethnic Russians or the non-ethnic Russians? In 2011, the highest total fertility replacements, or the highest total fertility rates, I should say, were recorded in Chechnya. That was 3.362. Tiva, or Tuva, with 3.249. And in Gush Etya with 2.94. The Altai Republic with 2.836. The Sakha Republic with 2.057. Buryatia with 2.027. And Nenets Autonomous Okrug with 2.007. So those are not really where the majority of ethnic Russians are living. And this is a pattern that we see all over the globe, right? We see this sort of thing happening in the United States. We see it happening in Western Europe, where basically the majority ethnic group, the white ethnic group, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed ethnic group, is not having kids and everybody else is. The causes of that are a subject for another video, but this is what's happening. Until 2010, the Russian Republic of Chechnya was the region with the highest birth rate in the former USSR. However, in 2011, the Armenian province of Kashatagh overtook it, and it had 29.3 per thousand as opposed to 28.9. So, in conclusion, Russia is headed to have a non-Slavic majority in the same way the United States and Western Europe is headed toward a non-white majority. Those who fear the results of a cultural shift in the West cannot view Russia as a reliable ally. Russia is just as vulnerable to multiracialism and multi-ethnic conflict, as well as the rise of Islam coming from Central Asia and the Middle East, as the West. So now I'm going to analyze the Russian bloc as a separate bloc from the Eastern European bloc for the reasons I stated. I include Turkey in this bloc for reasons of trade and recent foreign policy changes. So Turkey's biggest trade partner is Russia. Trade is a huge factor in who you're allied with militarily. Currently, Turkey is a part of NATO. However, NATO is starting to be viewed as outmoded, and again, this is a projection for the future. So it's not the present relations, but Turkey's actions in the Syrian civil war, its building of oil and gas pipelines with Russia through the Black Sea, seems to forecast a growing relationship and alliance between Russia and Turkey. Furthermore, if you look at Turkish opinion polls, public opinion polls, the majority of Turks view the United States as the greatest threat to Russian foreign policy. It's not the case with Russia. So the historical enmity between Russia and Turkey is changing, and Turkey's now viewing Russia as more of an ally than an enemy. Again, it could go either way, but I want to state that Russia has saved, maintained, and expanded its alliance with Syria. Prior to the Syrian civil war, the relationship with Russia and Syria, they had military bases, they had assets, but it wasn't so all-encompassing as it is today. And in fact, it continues to deepen. When Israel bombs Syria, Russia continues to supply Syria with better and newer and more, technologically advanced weaponry to defend itself. So I haven't included Syria in this analysis, but Turkey could be interpreted as a sort of stand-in for Syria. There are other countries like China and Iran that are sometimes considered to be an ally of Russia, but sometimes they're considered to be an enemy of Russia, or the relationship is too complicated. So I really only included 3 countries in the Russian bloc, that is Russia, Turkey, and Belarus. But you could switch. You could say, well, maybe Turkey's not going to be the ally, but maybe Syria is going to be the ally. Or maybe Syria is not going to be the ally, but Iraq's going to be the ally. So again, this was the most optimistic projection for Russia. Again, I'm trying to be optimistic, favoring the side of the Visegrad and not favoring Russia. But here's what we have. Russia has 147 million people, $1.6 trillion GDP. You have Turkey with 81 million people, 851 billion GDP. Belarus with 9.5 million people and a $54 billion GDP. The Russian military expenditure is an interesting thing because generally you would think that the official numbers would be higher than the actual numbers, and this is the case with the United States. So we actually spend less effectively on our military than we say we do. We say we are spending $700 million on the military, and yet a lot of that money is kind of going off into other projects that might not have to do with the military. There might be corruption involved. We know all about the military-industrial complex. So all of that money isn't necessarily going toward building an effective military. With Russia, there's an interesting thing going on that the official budget for the Russian military is $17.8 billion. And yet organizations like the SIPRI have estimated that in 2012, Russia was spending $90.7 billion on its military. So what's happening in Russia is that they... because the Russian state is very opaque, there's not a lot of transparency, they can say, yeah, we're only spending $18 billion on it, but actually they're spending $90 billion on it. And really the Russian strategy here is we want to give this appearance of efficiency, that we're spending very little, but we're getting a lot of bang for our buck. But in actuality, Russian military expenditure is pretty big. They do have a significant military compared to, again, we're going to compare other states like Italy. We're not going to do a Russia versus the European Union thing here because that's not the point. The total population of the Russian bloc, as I've described it, would be 237 million people, less than the Visegrad, and the total GDP would be 2.48 trillion, but more than the Visegrad. And the GDP per capita would be 10.5, or it would be 10,471, which isn't very good. It's about half of the Visegrad. So in the the GDP in the Visegrad, the GDP of the Visegrad's over 5 trillion. So this would be half of the Visegrad. So obviously this Russian bloc, its power is that basically Turkey and Russia are very militarily capable states. In the same way we can look at the war between Iraq and Kuwait. Kuwait was a rich state, but it didn't have a strong military. Iraq had a very powerful military, and so your GDP and your military aren't a one-to-one correlation. Russia does have a very powerful military. Turkey is a very powerful military. And so these two together, joined in one, do present a formidable force, although of course they are very poor. Again, their GDP per capita is about half that of Black Americans, so it's a pretty mixed picture there. We have excluded two key players from this analysis, Britain and the United States, and the reason for that is that with Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, there was a possibility, and I suppose there still is a possibility, that these two states could be anti-European Union forces, that they could be supporting a Visegrad group, in fact. However, if Trump loses in 2020, which is entirely possible, or if the Brexit deal maintains really close relationship between Britain and EU, these trends might reverse. It might come to pass that the United States goes back towards supporting the EU, and that Britain goes back towards supporting the EU. So just for reference, Britain's population is 66 million, $2.6 trillion GDP. GDP per capita is about 40,000. And the projected trends are increasing secularization, increasing population due to immigration and non-white fertility. The United States, 326 million people, biggest economy in the world, $19 trillion, GDP per capita, huge, about $60,000. African American GDP per capita, however, is around $20,000, and the population is increasing due to immigration and non-white fertility. Military expenditure officially is $716 billion. However, the IHS estimate in 2013 was that the expenditure was only $582 billion. So there might be some disparity there in terms of effective expenditure. However, in terms of cultural trends, we could say that there are increasing secularization. And so that's sort of in the background of all this. Now we're going to get to the conclusion part of this analysis. The European Union is primarily an alliance between France and Germany. These are the traditional hegemonic powers of continental Europe. You had Napoleon, you had Hitler. These are the two nation-states that have been able to project their power at key points in European history to try to take over the entire continent. Both of them failed ultimately, but that legacy remains, and now that the two of them are in an alliance that really we've never seen before in world history, at least not since maybe the Battle of Tours or something like that. But here we have something really powerful, the alliance between France and Germany. The question of if France will ever leave the EU was up in the air with Marine Le Pen. Could she have won? She only got 33%. Now Macron, who beat her with 67%, he's deeply unpopular due to the yellow vests. Is he going to be able to hang on? Will the European Union be threatened? Time will tell. In Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland's growing, but it's probably going to hit a similar limit to the Front National, around 33%. Again, I included Italy in this analysis. I think that is the most optimistic projection, that you're going to get Italy into your Visegrad group. However, I think it's extremely unlikely, and the reason is for economic reasons. We have Spain, Greece, and Italy. These are the three Mediterranean European Union members, and their economies are very debt-heavy and they're very fragile. These countries are extremely dependent upon the fact that they use the euro. And if they were to leave the European Union and they could no longer use the euro, they would have a huge shock to their system. It would be deeply unpopular. It caused a huge problem. And so I think the Italian economy is really tied at this point to France and Germany. It would be very difficult for them to split off. However, Italian politics are extremely anti-immigrant at this point compared to other Western European countries. I still don't think it's enough to have a clean break from the European Union. I think that it would be a very surprising thing. Another thing to look at is even if we got Italy into the Visegrad, Italy performed exceedingly poorly in the last two world wars, both World War I and World War II. Italy doesn't have the huge population of Russia. It doesn't have the natural resources of Russia. It doesn't have the brain power of Germany or France or Britain. In warfare, it's always been very slow and cumbersome, and troops haven't performed well. Now, what's happened since World War II is that military power is shifting from trenches and tank battles towards cyberspace. So what's really important now is how can you manipulate public opinion? How can you, computer programming, social media, all of these things are more mental activities. And so really, when you think about the great generals of World War II, I don't think about Italian generals. I'm thinking about, British or German. I guess there was de Gaulle, and you had in America Patton, people like this. But I don't think the Italians have this cognitive elite that is necessary to win a Cold War. Italy would theoretically be the leading nation of the Visegrad Union, and I think it would perform extremely poorly against France and Germany if there was a metapolitical conflict. The next two biggest members of the Visegrad Union would be Poland and Ukraine. As I've mentioned, these, and if you go to these countries, again, these are people who their purchasing power is on par with African Americans. They are their nationalist movements are obsessed with really petty issues about burial sites, and the Ukrainians aren't giving us Poles the respect that we deserve, and Ukraine strong and Poland strong, and it's very there's a lot of derogatory terms we could use. Of course, I'm not saying all Poles and Ukrainians are like this, but I'm just saying that if the Visegrad Group is to be constructed around the telos of ethno-nationalism, these nationalist voices would have a lot more weight to them than they currently do, and that could be very problematic. If the Italians were not involved, you would have a Visegrad Group led by either Poland or Ukraine. And the leadership would be very much a contentious, that would really inflame tensions between Poland and Ukraine. Because on the one hand, Poland has the bigger GDP, but on the other hand, Ukraine has the bigger population. So who gets a bigger voice? How do you govern this Visegrad Group? It would be very difficult. There would be no clear leader. And if a leader, and I would favor Poland. Poland is more developed. Poland is richer. If Poland did take leadership of the Visegrad Group, Ukrainian nationalists couldn't accept this. And so, in my opinion, Ukraine is not going to be ever threatened by non-white immigration in the near future, and so Ukraine would actually continue in terms of being a pro-EU country. And so I would actually add, just like I would say Italy would be ultimately on the side of the EU for economic reasons, I would say Ukraine would be on the side of France and Germany mostly for cultural reasons. It cannot get along with Poland at this point. Now, if that changes at some point in the future, okay, I'd like to see the data, but for now, I'm just not seeing it. If Italy and Ukraine were pro-EU and they don't join the Visegrad Union would have, it would decrease its total population by about 100 million people. There would only be 156 million left in the Visegrad Group. Huge reduction. It would lose 2 trillion in GDP. Its largest military would be Poland, and Poland only spends 12 billion a year on its military. That's like chump change, right? Very small military. Poland, I can't think of the last time Poland was ever successful in a military conflict. Again, we're talking about Visegrad Group going up against France and Germany, 2 of the greatest military powers of all time. How is it going to contend? And again, this war is not going to be a war of tanks and bombs and guns and planes. It's going to be a war of ideology. It's going to be a war of cyberspace. It's going to be a war of social media. Who is good at doing that? Look at the Arab Spring. Who funded the Arab Spring? How did that happen? Who manipulated the social media? We can trace that back to George Soros, if you want a household name. But there are a lot of other unnamed actors who ultimately can be traced back to the West, who were instrumental in organizing the Arab Spring. And there was a very small number of people, very, very well-funded people, who brought down a number of Arab governments. Pretty impressive. And so if that's what the Visegrad is facing, the fact that the Visegrad's not united, in Germany and France, you have 2 really big nations, very well federalized nations, versus the Visegrad Union. Again, we're talking about 20 different countries. They all speak different languages, so very hard to unify into a single force. When we look at the total military budget of the Visegrad Union, it might barely reach 30 million if they all pool their money together. It would not represent a state or a group of states which could successfully either challenge the Eurasian bloc of Russia or the Western bloc of the EU. Now, the assumptions that I've made within this analysis are that the Visegrad Group could firstly expand itself and secondly secede. It's certainly possible that the Visegrad Group could expand within the current EU. I don't question that. In fact, it already has. However, it is questionable as to whether Visegrad nations will ever leave the EU. They're extremely dependent upon the economies of Germany and France. And so, compared to the threat of non-white immigration or immigration in general, it's very difficult to imagine a world in which they would totally make a clean break from the EU. In the short term, it doesn't seem as if the EU will disintegrate. I could be wrong. But it certainly doesn't seem like the Visegrad Group is going to declare independence from the EU. At least for economic reasons alone, these Eastern European countries need that cash flow and the flow of imports and exports, financial contact with Germany through the European Agreement. As long as these factors remain true, the Visegrad Group, which some people have called an implicit white nationalism, it's going to continue to exist as a bulwark against Russian expansionism, especially in countries like Poland, which have a strong anti-Russian nationalist movement. Other countries like Romania and Moldova have a similar feeling toward Russia. They associate Russian domination with communism. They associate communism with political repression and poverty. So again, these are countries that they are going to ultimately, so long as they're not forced to receive this non-white immigration, they're going to view the European Union as a force that's protecting them from Russian expansionism. Countries like Poland, countries like Moldova, countries like Romania, they're going to ultimately side with the European Union. If they had a choice between, hey, we could go it alone with our intermarium, we could try to be independent and risk being conquered by Russia, or we could just stay close to the European Union and have assured freedom from Russia, they're going to choose the European Union, in my opinion. We'll give another example of the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has basically had a sexual revolution. Since 1991, the Czech Republic has consistently trended towards greater sexual liberation on topics such as the permissibility of adultery, on pornography, and you can track this through the rates of STD and STI transmission. They've increased since 1991. You'd think with advanced technology, with condoms, with the civilization of the West, that these would all go down, but actually they've increased. At the same time that this liberalization has happened, Miloš Zeman, the president of Czech Republic, he's consistently called for closer ties to Russia. However, in either interpretation, whether you're viewing Czech Republic through a social lens or whether you're viewing it through President Zeman, there's very little chance here that Czech Republic is going to be this independent white nationalist state or part of the Visegrad. It seems that it's very clear in Czech Republic that it's both moving to the left socially and it's moving toward Russia politically in a number of factors. So there is no great demand for independence, and if you look at opinion polls, Czechs are one of the peoples who most frequently view themselves as Europeans first rather than as Czech people first. Now let's look at Serbia. Serbia is a nation that I said could possibly be part of the Visegrad Union. Serbia has maintained a strong relationship with Russia since the First World War, during the time of the Pan-Slavic movement, and this relationship has continued through recent NATO intervention in Serbia, creating the artificial state of Kosovo. Serbia has continued to have strong tensions between itself and Croatia. Croatia just joined the European Union. And so Serbia is strongly anti-European Union, pro-Russia, and Croatia just joined the European Union. Both of these states have a strong attraction to these two power blocs. Serbia is completely fine being the lapdog of Russia. Croatia fine being the lapdog of the European Union. It's hard to see what these countries would have to gain in going independent and uniting with each other in a Visegrad Union, and it's easy to see what they would have to gain by being part of a larger power bloc that would give them the counterbalance to oppose the other. And again, I can go back to Switzerland and how it was part of the Visegrad, but this I would see as being even less likely than the Italian-led Visegrad. The Swiss government has always avoided political and military entanglements. It generally welcomes immigration, even though the population itself is pretty anti-immigrant. And the country has a history of close ties to the world of international banking. So despite the anti-immigration stance of the Swiss populace, I would say that its traditional role as a neutral state would prevent its incorporation into the Visegrad. I would say it's less likely to become a Visegrad nation than even Italy. So looking at the remaining states of Visegrad, if we put up a map, it's pretty easy to see there's nothing here which could be successfully independent in a political sense, in a cultural sense, in an economic sense, in an ideological sense. There's nothing that could maintain its independence in the face of a two-pronged attack by both a Eurasian Russia and a secularizing, Islamizing West. The real question then becomes, where do these so-called third-position states go, like Greece, for example? Are they going toward more a Eurasianist Russia or more toward the European Union? Is Norway going to just side with the European Union because of culture and geography, or is it going to increase its ties with Russia, for whom it shares a border? What about Denmark? Is Denmark going to go toward the Russia, or is there going to be a more complex situation where Russia is going to be funding anti-immigrant parties within these states, but not completely controlling the state? There's going to be a kind of implicit alliance with certain political parties, but not other parties. This actually mirrors the relationship that the Soviet Union traditionally had with Western European countries, where it would fund the Communist Party or the left-wing party in that country, and so to that extent it would have some influence, but of course that party would not necessarily dominate politics, and so it wouldn't have complete influence over the country. So, we're entering a kind of Cold War scenario in Europe between the West and between the East. Russia is growing. Russia is a tenacious state. Russia is secularizing, and Russia is Islamizing. The propaganda of Putin wants to put out this image that the churches are growing and that everyone's becoming an Orthodox Christian. We're going to revive the Tsardom. That's not actually happening if you look at the data, if you look at the number of Russians who believe that religion is an important part of their lives. You're actually going to find that Russians are extremely secular, and that this trend cannot be reversed quick enough to counteract increasing secularization. So while you could talk to some young people and say, well, here's an example of a young Russian who is going back to church even though their parents didn't go to church. Okay, well, that I can show you people who are converting to Scientology. It doesn't mean that's a long-lasting, sustainable trend that represents the entire movement of society as an organic whole. I would say the broad stroke trend is that Russia is moving more towards secularization, even as the Orthodox Church tries to assert a renewed power, a power that it didn't have during the Soviet era because of the orthodoxy of communism, which was secular at the time. Now Putin has given them a little more free rein to sort of stretch their muscles, and they're trying to move Russian society in the way that previously they were barred from doing so. But again, the social trend among the populace itself is still in a secular direction. It's also in a Muslim direction because of the demographics of various regions, oblasts, okrugs. They are moving toward a non-ethnic Russian majority in Russia, in the same way that we're seeing the non-white ethnic majority in America and Western Europe is also coming. All of these changes are coming, and you are going to see a Cold War between the two. But ultimately, Western Europe and Russia are going in a very similar direction. What's interesting about the Visegrad region is it doesn't have a lot to economically offer third world immigrants. It doesn't have a lot of welfare for non-citizens. And so non-white immigrants are not really interested in going to Poland or Hungary or any of these states. It's not very attractive to them. And so these, in the same way that West Virginia is a very white state because it's poor, you do have this Visegrad region serving sort of as a big white ghetto for homogeneous white spaces. Some people might like to move to Poland or Hungary or Ukraine because housing is cheap, especially if you have savings in US dollars. Things are pretty cheap and people are pretty white, and it can be viewed as a good time. But in terms of a geopolitical force, the Visegrad Group is not going to be a driving geopolitical force in the 21st century, in the same way that West Virginia is not going to be a driving force for change in America in the 21st century. These are basically areas where, for one reason or another, economic development has created an impoverished environment, a depressed environment. Immigrants simply don't want to go there. Non-whites don't want to go there. They're not attracted to it. And so it sort of remains this reservation. I mean, you can go to these places. You can go to West Virginia or Ukraine, and there's a lot of similarities between the two places. They both have a lot of problems with drugs and prostitution and poverty, lack of education, and they are very, very, very white places. And so when we talk about white genocide, the extinction of white people, so long as these places remain economically depressed, they probably will remain very, very white places. It doesn't mean they're going to have any geopolitical significance. There is certainly white people have the potential to be world conquerors. We've seen that with Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. And we've seen that with Napoleon. We've seen that with other very powerful Europeans. So white people have this potential to give birth to individual geniuses who can lead nations to glory. But whiteness is not enough. Simply being white isn't enough to qualify you as a world historical actor. There are plenty of white people who are poor, mediocre, and insignificant. And, unfortunately, these people are going to, they're not even going to have the choice of choosing a side. They're going to have the side chosen for them. So whatever leader scrambles into power in the corrupt, political system that is Eastern Europe, whichever leader gets into power, they will decide whether to choose the European version of multiracialism or the Russian version of multiracialism. And that's pretty much the future. Now, insofar as white people continuing to have a world historical purpose or a world historical influence, it's going to be within this system in the same way that there were white pharaohs in Egypt. There were also non-white pharaohs in Egypt, but there were white pharaohs. And even though Europe was not a homogeneous white country, white people were still able to have a world historical impact on the culture of Egypt. They did it elsewhere in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, in the Hittite Empire. They did it in Greece. So white people have had a world historical influence despite the fact they were not the homogeneous population. Now, of course, it is totally natural and normal as a human being to look at a member of the opposite sex and to be sexually attracted to them. And so it's completely natural to be attracted to people's bodies. Now, we can recognize that and at the same time say, well, that shouldn't be the telos of life here on Earth. That it's not just our object to have sex with attractive members of the opposite sex. That's not what it's all about. Even though that is an instinct that we have, we still have to kind of keep it in our pants, and we have to discipline ourselves, and we have to work toward a greater telos than just having sex with people. Now, to flip that argument, which I think a lot of quote-unquote traditionalists or ethno-nationalists would agree with that, but to flip that argument on its head and say, well, it's totally natural and normal to want to be around members of your same ethnic group, to be surrounded by members of an in-group, to hear people speaking the same language as you. It is normal and natural to want to live in an area where everyone has the same religion, the same norms, the same ethnic background, we all look the same, talk the same, we all feel to be part of a common family, a common in-group. It's normal and natural to want that, in the same way it's normal and natural to want to have sex with members, attractive members of the opposite sex. And even though it is normal and natural, it doesn't mean it should be the telos of our life. Again, I don't blame people for wanting these things, because I'm human too, and I also want these things. But there's a difference between a desire and a telos. A desire is something we recognize as part of our human nature, as part of our evolutionary history. This is something that evolution has, through many generations, it's directed our desire toward wanting these things which ancestrally in the past have been very good for us. Today, however, we don't live in that historical period, and so now our telos might change. We might need to make our goal in life a little more than just living in a homogeneous ethno-state. We might need to make our telos a little more than just having sex with attractive members of the opposite sex. So I'm not here to call people evil or stupid for having an ethno-nationalist desire. I'm not here to call people evil or stupid for wanting to or having a sexual attraction to people. What I'm saying is that cannot instruct us upon what our telos is, what is really good for humanity, what's good for ourselves, how do we develop as people, how do we develop as a species, how do we develop as living things here in the universe. What is our telos? I think to make a naturalistic argument, simply saying, well, we desire this, it feels natural to us, it feels good, that's the natural way to live, I don't think that's a very strong argument. So we do have to find something outside of it, or it has to be grounded in principles which are not tied to our instincts, because instincts they update very, very slowly. And so while the environment around us changes quickly, instincts update slowly. So there's basically my argument here, if we want to go back to Kalergi. Kalergi said that the people who deserve to rule over Europe are the Jews, because the Jews, they have what it takes. They have the aristocratic spirit. And you can read what Kalergi actually had to say and why he defended this position, and why he thought the Jews had an aristocratic spirit, and how he defined the aristocratic spirit. But what I'm saying is that if you want to influence the future, if you want to not be a slave, if you don't want to just be sort of a follower, or if you don't want to be a drop of water in a wave, just carried along by historical events, if you want to shape historical events, you do have to develop a kind of aristocratic spirit. You do have to develop higher qualities. Well, you can disagree or agree with Kalergi, but the basic point stands that someone is going to direct the future. And people who just appeal to how they feel, or how things should be, or how they wish things could be, rather than working hard to understand how the world works, confronting real truths, even if they are unfortunate, or even if they make people upset, because you set up an expectation. Someone, reality defeats your expectation, you can feel betrayed and you can feel upset. But to have the temperance of mind, to have the ability, the tenaciousness to be able to look at reality for what it is, and to shape your expectations around reality rather than to warp reality to fit your expectations, that is the mark of the sort of people who do influence history. So again, you're either going to be a follower, or you're going to be a leader. And a leader is someone who basically looks at things as they really are, and they develop the skills necessary to navigate the world as it is, rather than becoming really good at a fantasy or a video game. People who play role-playing games, people who play Dungeons and Dragons, people who play video games, these kinds of people are very interested in playing games. So the question is, why don't they play the game of life? Why don't they try to become rich? Or why don't they try to become a religious leader? Why don't they try to become some other competitive athlete or something? Why are they trying to win this artificial game of Dungeons and Dragons, or a video game? It's because they don't like the rules of life, because the rules of life don't appeal to them, because the rules of life to them seem unfair, because the rules of life to them don't appeal to their strengths and their interests. They want to play the game of medieval knights. They want to play a game because that seems like a more fair game. It seems like a more fun game, a more appealing game. But ultimately, as human beings, we are made to play games. We are made to recognize a series of rules and then try to compete within those rules. Everything has rules. From the simplest game, the most open sandbox game still has rules. they can be mathematical in a sense of determining the nature of that simulated reality. And people are so insistent on playing a game that appeals to their sense of how the game should be that they will immerse themselves in fake games, false games, rather than real games, games that impact their future, that impact their children's future. So again, if you're interested in positioning your children in a good place where they're going to not just be the driftwood of humanity, that they're going to be drifting around and just sort of pushed and pulled along with the waves, but actually they're going to be given and bequeathed some limited ability of control over their future, control over their destiny, an element of free will, then you have to be willing to play these games. You have to be willing to say, look, I'm going to adjust what I want to reality. Like, I'm not going to say that reality should be like a Dungeons and Dragons game. You have to be saying, no, reality is what it is, and whatever it is, I'm going to try to find it out, understand it, and I'm going to alter myself accordingly rather than trying to choose the game that is most fun to me. Because that is, video games are a way to control a population. Dungeons and Dragons are a way to control a population. The whole corporate culture built up around them. Now, people have been playing games for a very long time. People play chess and other games like that. So I'm not against the play itself, and certainly young people should play games because it allows people to make mistakes and it allows people to exercise their critical thinking ability. I think it's a great thing if young kids play chess. But in terms of, again, it depends on what your goals are. If you care about impacting the world at all, then you have to understand it as it is and not as how you think it should be. So I think that's enough for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.